The prevailing narrative is a misdirection. Media fixates on the kinetic cost of conflict, missile salvos, carrier groups, troop deployments. This is a deliberate distraction, focusing your attention on the explosion while ignoring the fuse. The initial strike in a peer-level confrontation will not be a fireball. It will be absolute silence. The blueprint for this vector is not theoretical. Coordinated cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, such as the targeting of Romanian energy and water producers, are test runs. They are systemic probes. Analysts at RUSI confirm that the primary targets in a state-level conflict are not armies, but the digital nervous system that commands them. The real vectors are undersea and orbital. This creates the blind Leviathan scenario. A global power already stretched by multi-front contingency planning from the Taiwan Strait to the Korean Peninsula is suddenly deaf and blind. Its satellites are dazzled. Its undersea data cables are severed. It cannot see threats, confirm targets, or communicate with its own forces. Here, the financial liability becomes a kinetic accelerant. The $38 trillion national debt, as flagged by Treasury, mathematically forbids a prolonged, conventional war of attrition. There is no economic endurance. A blinded power, lacking the solvency to outlast an opponent, is forced by its own protocols to escalate. It must bypass conventional stages and shift its deterrence posture from launch on warning to launch on silence. The absence of data becomes the trigger. This is not a choice. It is a calculation. The conflict in Ukraine is not a territorial dispute. It is a solvency crisis. CSIS analysis confirms the war became a domestic liability for Russia, financially unsustainable and politically unpopular. This economic weakness forced a pivot. When a state's balance sheet breaks, it cannot project power through conventional means. The cost of a multi-front kinetic campaign becomes mathematically prohibitive. This is not a uniquely Russian vulnerability. It is a blueprint. According to Fortune, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen herself has sounded the alarm on the U.S. national debt, a figure now exceeding $38 trillion. This isn't just a number. It is a strategic liability. It represents a fundamental constraint on the nation's capacity for long-duration, high-intensity conflict. Consider the Taiwan-Korea vector. Reports from Agenzia Nova confirm U.S. forces in South Korea are already preparing for a potential crisis in the Taiwan Strait. The kinetic cost of sustaining such a two-front engagement is astronomical, an expenditure a debtor nation cannot endure. The math doesn't lie. Protracted conventional war is a luxury the insolvent cannot afford. This systemic weakness forces a protocol shift away from expensive endurance and toward affordable, overwhelming force. The objective is to compensate for a lack of financial solvency with a credible threat of rapid, asymmetric escalation. This is why we see events like the cyber attacks on Romanian energy infrastructure, a low-cost vector with strategic impact. Financial liability is converted into kinetic risk. The accelerant is insolvency. The logical outcome is a recalibrated deterrence model where the nuclear threshold is no longer a last resort, but a primary strategic option on the menu. It becomes the most cost-effective tool to enforce red lines when you can no longer pay for the conventional alternative. This isn't a failure of policy, it is the mathematical result of it. The kinetic cost of asset liquidation has collapsed. Analysts at RUSI published the core equation, A $5 million main battle tank can be neutralized by a $500 first-person view drone. This is not a battlefield anomaly. It is the new economic blueprint for warfare. The math is irrefutable. This 10,000 to 1 cost asymmetry is what strategists term the democratization of violence. The barrier to entry for inflicting systemic damage has been erased. It grants smaller state and non-state actors the ability to wage a war of attrition against a superpower they could never match symmetrically. Cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, like those targeting Romanian energy producers, are the digital equivalent. Low-cost leverage, high-impact liability. This new reality arrives during a terminal solvency crisis. With the national debt exceeding a reported $38 trillion, the capacity for a sustained, multi-front conventional conflict, such as the one U.S. forces in South Korea are preparing for across the Taiwan vector, is a mathematical fiction. The United States cannot afford a war of attrition. It lacks the economic endurance. The primary kinetic vector remains the Taiwan Strait. Reports confirm U.S. forces in South Korea are preparing for this exact contingency. This is the blueprint for a conventional, multi-front conflict. However, the financial architecture to sustain it has evaporated. As Treasury Secretary Yellen warns, the national debt is testing a red line. This solvency crisis renders the old playbook obsolete. The result is a doctrinal shift toward gray zone staging. These are not primary battlefields. They are proxy laboratories. We see this with coordinated cyber attacks on Romanian water and energy producers, low-cost probes of critical NATO infrastructure. Analysts at CSS and RUSI do not view these as isolated events. They are systemic tests. These zones, from Eastern Europe to the Southern Hemisphere, are used to calibrate response times, test asymmetric protocols, and map vulnerabilities before a high-stakes kinetic engagement. It is the beta testing of a new warfighting doctrine, driven not by choice, but by mathematical necessity. The launch on warning protocol is a mathematical certainty born from systemic weakness. It is not a strategy. It is a pre-programmed response dictating that strategic assets are launched upon detection of an incoming attack, not after impact. The logic is irrefutable. A nation that absorbs a first strike loses its capacity to retaliate. The entire framework is built to circumvent the kinetic cost of hesitation. This protocol is now vulnerable to a new vector: digital incapacitation. Coordinated cyber attacks, such as those targeting Romanian energy and water infrastructure, provide the blueprint. According to CSIS analysts, the true target is not the civilian grid, but the military's command, control, and communications C3 network that depends on it. An adversary no longer needs to physically destroy a radar installation. They only need to sever its data connection to the command node. This creates the fog of digital war. When the early warning radar feed suddenly goes black, the commander is forced into a zero-sum dilemma. Is the screen blank because of a cyber attack? Or is it blank because the satellites and radar stations have already been destroyed in a decapitation strike? In this scenario, the absence of data becomes the critical data point. The protocol mathematically forces the commander to assume the worst-case kinetic event is underway. This is the endgame of systemic insolvency. A global power facing a $38 trillion national debt, as noted by Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, while simultaneously preparing for multi-front conflicts like a Taiwan Strait crisis, has no economic endurance. The financial inability to fund a protracted conventional war makes a rapid, overwhelming response the only viable doctrine. The cyber attack is the accelerant, transforming a solvency crisis into a launch-on-warning cascade. The fear of being blinded forces the launch. The $38 trillion national debt is not an economic talking point, it is a strategic directive. Treasury Secretary Yellen's warning is the mathematical confirmation of systemic insolvency. This liability dictates that the established blueprint for global power projection, a sustained, multi-front, conventional conflict, is no longer financially viable. The kinetic cost exceeds the national liquidity. Simultaneously, U.S. forces in South Korea are preparing for a potential crisis in the Taiwan Strait, a clear vector for multi-front engagement. This operational readiness represents a protocol the balance sheet can no longer support. When economic endurance is zero, the only remaining variable is speed and severity. The deterrence protocol is forced to recalibrate from a war of attrition to a strategy of overwhelming, rapid, and asymmetric escalation. This recalibration requires a signal, a demonstration of a new launch-on-warning posture that targets an adversary's core functions, not its military assets. The coordinated cyber attacks on Romanian water and energy infrastructure provide the tactical blueprint, an attribution impossible event that cripples a system without a kinetic trace. The goal is not to win a war, but to demonstrate the capacity to preemptively collapse a society. The calibration forecast. Within 9 months, expect a catastrophic 72-hour shutdown of the Port of Los Angeles' digital logistics network. Crane operations, container tracking, and customs processing will fail simultaneously. Legacy media will report a cascading system glitch or a ransomware attack. It will be neither. This is the calibration shot, a deliberate test of a new deterrence doctrine. Our USI analysts will note it was a message. Financial liability has been converted into asymmetric first strike leverage.